everyone, and welcome to New Consciousness Review. I'm Miriam Knight, and our guest is Hilary Webb, the managing editor of Anthropology of Consciousness, a peer-reviewed journal of the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness. Hilary received her undergraduate degree in journalism from New York University, and she went on to earn an MA in Consciousness Studies from Goddard College and a PhD in psychology from Saybrook University. She's the author of a number of books, Exploring Shamanism, Traveling Between the Worlds, Conversations with Contemporary Shamans. And the book we're going to discuss today, Hilary, you will correct me if I mispronounce it, Yanantin and Masintin in the Andean World, Complementary Dualism in Modern Peru.
Perfect.
Thank you. I understand we're speaking to you from southern Maine.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Hilary. It's such a pleasure. First of all, I had never heard of the field of the anthropology of consciousness. That's totally fascinating to me. What is it?
Yes, well, it's a subdivision of anthropology, as you would gather. And, I think anybody who's involved in the anthropology of consciousness is probably going to have a little bit different definition. For me, it's really a look at different cultures or even cultures within our own culture, looking at how do people relate to this thing that we call consciousness? What is their definition? How do they relate to it in terms of going into altered states, either through journeying, psychedelic medicines, that kind of thing. How do they use these ordinary or non-ordinary experiences of consciousness in order to make meaning of the world? So essentially, it's looking at people's relationships to that thing that makes us so human, inner self and the conscious process.
Mm-hmm. The book that we're going to be discussing focuses on a concept called Yanantin, and I was very curious as to what aroused your interest in it.
Yeah. The first time I ever heard the word Yanantin was in 2001 when I went to Peru for the very first time to study the shamanic cultures and concepts of that area of the world. And I was sitting in the Sacred Valley in Peru and watching an old shaman create a despacho. And a despacho is basically a ceremonial offering to the earth. And it's kind of a beautiful mandala that's made out of things like flower petals and candy and confetti, things as exotic as llama fetus, llama fat, little icons. And each item represents something specific for the healing of self, other, and planet. And one of the first items to be included within the despacho was this little figurine, and it was split down the middle, half of it pink, half of it yellow. And the old shaman said, "This is Yanantin, complementary opposites." And, it's sort of hard to really sort of logically express my reaction. It was just this idea of complementary opposites. Something about it grabbed me. And what I was to learn later was that complementary opposites is really the basis of the indigenous Andean Peruvian philosophical model. And, whereas in the Western world, there is, I think, a tendency within our philosophical viewpoints, within our scientific viewpoints, to see the world as made up of antagonistic opposites, where there's this battle being waged between the two, and one is trying to conquer the other. Whereas in the Andean model, it's very complementary. So really, I just was fascinated by this concept. And when it came time for me to do my doctoral research, I really wanted to go back and look at what that means, psychologically speaking. How does it differ when you look at the world through this lens of complementarity rather than one of antagonism? So that's sort of where that came from.
It's almost a metaphor for the new consciousness, isn't it?
I think so. I hope so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When I first started the book, it started off almost like a PhD thesis, and I thought, okay, well, I can skim through this, but I couldn't. It kept on grabbing me. And I had to read the whole thing cover to cover. It was fascinating. which kind of surprised me. I admit that I did skip over all of the footnotes and the references, but the view that it gave of these, first of all, these two fascinating shamans and their eloquence in expressing what is such a profound worldview. I really would love for you to somehow try and share or encompass the highlights of this for our listeners, because it was so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was such a process for me. And, you bring up the sort of the scholarly aspect of it. And it's funny because I went to Peru for my first fieldwork trip as going in with my scholarly mindset and thinking, okay, I've got to get data and facts and figures, and I'm going to write this ethnography about how it is to be an Andean person looking at the world through this complementary lens and, thinking of it very sort of rationally and linearly. And when I got there, really the first conversation I had with Amado, who is my primary research participant, he's a young shaman, I sat down and I opened up my notebook and I pulled out a pen and I said, okay, how do you define Yanantin? And he sort of smiled at me and said, well, out of respect, I don't define Yanantin, and may I suggest that you download it from the cosmos instead? And of course, being in my sort of rational mind, I went into this panic mode of what does that mean? And, I don't believe that's possible, and I don't understand, and how am I going to face my professors when I come home, and this, that, and the other. And what he meant by that was essentially a couple things. One was that he really wanted me to have an experience myself of this complementary worldview rather than just interviewing people and asking them what their perspective was. And specifically, he wanted me to go into ceremony with San Pedro, which is a mescaline cactus that has been used ceremonially in that region of the world for thousands of years. And so, I write in the book a lot about the mental wrangling I had to go through, both sort of personally and this idea of, do I really want to go into an altered state like this? And not only feeling nervous about it, but feeling this skepticism. Can I really gain knowledge in that way? So really what came out of this, what started off as a very sort of traditional ethnography, turned into what's called an autoethnography. So basically me using my emotions and some of my experience in order to illuminate this concept of Yanantin. Mm-hmm. And I was really fortunate to go to a school, and my graduate work, as you said, my master's degree at Goddard College and my PhD at Saybrook University. Very fortunate that those are two places that really are so willing to look at and let you balance both the intellectual and the personal in order to come up with this very holistic way of knowing a subject. So the book is really a lot about my a combination of the scholarly aspects of this idea and also my personal experiences. So, and that made it really fun to write and really rewarding for me on a personal level.
I thought it was interesting that Amado talks about learning the mystery from his grandfather and how it had been underground for many, many years, if not centuries. Tell us, and yet this tradition goes back thousands of years. So tell us what happened, particularly during the conquest of Spain. What happened to these traditions?
Right. Well, in about the 1500s, of course, there was the Spanish conquest where the Catholic Church and the conquistadors came in and began the conversion of the Indians. And it's interesting to see how, despite the fact, Catholicism came in and has really made a significant presence in the teachings and in the traditions of the land, they did somewhat go underground in some levels, and in some levels they became syncretized, meaning, they took the Catholic teachings and molded them to their own complementary worldview in their own way. But certainly when the conquistadors came in, there was this, over time, subtle and not so subtle degradation of these traditions, and this idea that these traditions are evil or bad in some way. And, as time went on, Western culture continues to infiltrate, and not, the quote unquote evil aspects of it becomes, oh, this is just, superstition, and there's no base in fact. So you have both Western religion and Western science sort of going in and saying, these traditions have no real meaning and no real use. But, when you go to Peru, you see they really have not disappeared at all. And what Amado was telling me was that his grandfather really hid his practices for a long time because they just weren't accepted either by his family, his community, and he kind of held them to himself. And when Amado came along, Amado showed an aptitude and had an initiation experience that I refer to in the book. And at that point, his grandfather decided, I think that the teaching should be passed on to my grandson. So that's kind of part of Amado's story, and I think that's the story of many of the young shamans in Peru today.
Mm-hmm. I remember interviewing Hank Wesselman about his book about a Hawaiian kahuna who was really the last in his lineage from Kamehameha. And he transmitted the knowledge for the first time to be written down because he was afraid it would be lost. Do you find in Peru that this knowledge or mystery is being revived and coming above ground?
I do. And ironically, perhaps for some of the same reasons that it went below ground to begin with. I mean, I think that, the Western interest in shamanism and many people going to Peru in order to get an experience of Peruvian shamanism, it's like anything, it's got a double-edged sword. But one of the things that it has done that seems to be positive is with these Westerners coming in and saying, hey, this is something we want to learn. This is something that matters to us. It's important. I think a lot of the younger people are starting to go, okay, wait, maybe I need to revisit and look at, what I consider to be the importance of my own cultural traditions.